Okay, everyone, hello and welcome to today's webinar on accessibility planning, the key to successful inclusion. This webinar is the first of a three-part series on accessibility. The next two sessions will look more closely at accessible marketing and programming. I'm Kristen Johnson, Local Arts Advancement Program Manager with Americans for the Arts. We've got a great program planned for you today, and I'm excited to introduce our speakers. But first, a couple of quick reminders. First, ArtsU is our e-learning platform offering a variety of training options to support your work in the field. Be sure to visit artsu.americansforthearts.org to view more upcoming events. Next, there will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. However, if you think of a question along the way, please feel free to type it into the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Please note that today's webinar includes live captioning. To view the live captions, please click and open the link in a new window that has been pasted into the chat box. It will open for you, or be sure to open it in a new tab or window. You will then just adjust both the window of the webinar and the window of the captions so that you can view both at the same time. I would also like to give a quick thank you and shout out to Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts for making this event and series possible. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today, John McEwen and Beth Prevor. John serves as the Executive Director of the New Jersey Theater Alliance, a service organization for the state's 33 professional theaters. John is the founder and chairman of the Cultural Access Network Project, a program of the New Jersey Theater Alliance and the New Jersey State Council on the Arts that assists the state's cultural organizations as they make their programs and services accessible to individuals with disabilities. And next we have Beth Prevor. Beth is a co-founder and executive director of Hands On, an arts service organization that advocates for access to arts for the deaf community and audiences with disabilities. For the last 30-plus years, Hands On has been providing access for the deaf and hard of hearing communities of New York City through sign language interpreted theater at some of New York City's most prestigious theaters, including the Roundabout Theater Company, the New York Shakespeare Festival, and the New Victory Theater. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to John and Beth. Thank you, everyone. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen. This is John McEwen.
And this is Beth Prevor.
And we're so delighted for Americans for the Arts for providing this series. And Beth and I are delighted to be with you today to discuss with you what we believe is really the very important step in ADA when you're thinking about the Americans with Disabilities Act in your organization, and that is planning. And we're going to be walking you through some language around accessibility. We're going to be talking about the importance of planning, that it's an organizational priority, not just the responsibility of one individual. Talking about some of the programming and services to keep in mind to make accessible. How do you reach and target market individuals for your programming? The importance of your facility as it relates to accessibility, and we'll also share with you some resources throughout our presentation. And as Kristen mentioned, at the end of our presentation, we are happy to address some of the questions that come forward. I will say, Kristen or Jacqueline, I do not see if you could turn over the leadership to me so I can advance the slides. There you go. Thank you so much. So I just went through the agenda with you in what we hope to cover during our time today. And it's really important before you begin any kind of accessible planning in your organization is to really understand the constituency. And I do want to say, as we before we get into the presentation, this is something that we provide our cultural organizations in New Jersey, and we are very honored and delighted with our partnership with the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, who has been true leaders in this work for the past 27 years that we have collaborated on the New Jersey Cultural Access Network project. And so as you learn this information today, as well as the next 2 webinars, that you give some thought of how that's going to work into your own accessible planning and policies at your agencies, and how you can share information and educating your grantees and constituencies around accessibility. So I think it's important for you to look at it, today's session through that lens. So to begin in terms of understanding about disability and its impact, I'm going to turn this next portion of the presentation over to Beth.
Thank you, John. Back up.
Yep.
Thanks. Okay, thanks. So it keeps moving ahead.
It's jumping.
Okay.
So there you go.
So, okay, thanks. So John and I both feel it's really important before we dive head on into accessibility planning to get a little bit of an understanding about the constituency that we're talking about. So I'm going to give you a very, very brief Disability 101 to kind of introduce the understanding as to why accessibility is really important. So I think in this first slide, it's really important to understand the impact that disability has on all our lives. And I think the first start is the numbers. There are approximately 57 million people with disabilities, which means that 1 in 5 individuals have a disability. And that's really not even taking into account the number of baby boomers who are aging quickly, the number of vets who are coming back who might have a disability. So that number of 57 million is probably small in comparison to the actual number. And then the other statistic I want to point out from this slide is really the last one on it, and it really talks about the idea that disability is the only category of diversity that anyone can join and at any point. And more to the point is that as we all age, the probability that all of us will be impacted, whether it's personal or through family, with disability is great and probably an absolute. So it's this idea that disability is something that not only is something that we need to think about with our organizations, but as a personal issue, that's something that we're all going to have to be tackling at some point in the future. So that's why it's important to talk about disability right from the start. So that being said, can we move ahead?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to this Disability 101, I want to talk just really briefly about some models of disability. And I think why this is really important is that these models give us an understanding personally about how we view disability. And I think that as we'll kind of point out later in the presentation, attitude and how we look at disability really does have an impact on our provision of services and how we view accessibility in our organizations. So the 2 models that I want to briefly talk about are the medical model and the social model of disability. And again, I'm going to give you a really brief overview of what these models are, and it's just to give you something to think about when you're thinking about disability. So the medical model really emphasizes that the impairment and the limitations that a person has is based on the person themselves, and it puts the onus on disabled people to fix whatever problem society thinks that they have and to fix their problems. So it doesn't look at the environment at all. It really looks on the person themselves and the limitations that the person themselves has. Now, the medical model, as we can make the assumption, was developed and coined not by people with disabilities. So on the other end of the spectrum of these models of disability, we have the social model, which is one of the models that I think in today's society is viewed as the much more pertinent and important model that we want to look at. And the social model really looks at disability from the understanding that disability really is constructed from the experience. And it looks at the barriers that are created in the environment and doesn't necessarily look at the relationship of the person having to fix their problem, but looks at society and the environment in terms of trying to fix that. So really, in kind of layman's terms, if I have a mobility disability and I'm confronted with a flight of stairs, it's the flight of stairs that really is much more impactful to my disability rather than me personally having a mobility disability. If the stairs weren't there, whether I have a disability or not, I can get in. So the barrier is constructed by society. So if we can start thinking about removing the environmental and the societal barriers, then the person's disability is much less important, and then access becomes much more of a communal and a societal issue rather than an issue of the person themselves. So I hope this just gives you a general understanding about how we think about disability and how we put the onus on either the individual or society when we're talking about removing the barriers that might exist for a person with a disability. So again, that is a very, very brief discussion of how we look at disabilities, and we bring that up really to point out that how you think about disability has an impact on how you ultimately provide services. So there we have Disability 101 in a nutshell.
Thank you, Beth. So we believe that in order for an organization to move forward in access and providing accessible programs and services and policies, that the organization must develop an ADA plan, much like organizations will develop a strategic plan to provide a roadmap for their programs and operations of their organization over a 3 to 5 year period. We believe that that's also important as you give thought to beginning your pathway in terms of providing accessible programs and services, as well as looking at accessibility internally in terms of your employment, in terms of hiring management, as well as hiring artists. So the first step in a successful ADA plan is making this an organizational priority. Too often organizations will say, oh, well, we're going to give this ADA responsibility over to the box office or the house manager or the marketing department. And then when that person leaves, then a lot of the work that the organization implemented tends to fall apart. Also, in order to actually implement things in a plan, you really do need to have everybody's involvement in developing the plan, but you need to most definitely have support from the top, from the Board of Trustees all the way down to your volunteers. So it must be an organizational priority. Also, this ADA plan will act as a roadmap. So if somebody does leave the organization, and there always is going to be one individual at the organization to make sure that the work is moving forward, but that does not mean that it's on just the shoulders of that organization, of that individual rather. So this plan, if somebody does leave, there is a roadmap in place so that the organization can continue their good work. It does involve all departments need to be involved in the development of the plan, implementing the plan. We're going to talk a little bit later about the importance of using advisory boards. So as you're developing programs and services, you want to have the guidance and support of individuals in your communities that are going to actually benefit from your programs and services, who can serve as ambassadors to share the news in their communities about the good work you're doing to serve this constituency. There are going to be some things that are readily achievable that you can begin to implement in your ADA work, but there are some things that definitely will need some dedicated financial resources. So thinking about an ADA, an access budget, and putting some financial resources behind these initiatives. And a very important step is the self-assessment. before you begin a plan, you really need to know what you currently have so you can know where you want to go. And we'll get into the importance of the self-assessment and specifics in just a little moment. Beth, you want to talk a little bit about the organizational priorities?
Sure. And I think, as John just mentioned, that the commitment to access really does cross like all phases and all parts of your organization. And I think sometimes, a lot of times when we talk about accessibility, we have a tendency of focusing specifically on audiences, which is an important component in this whole discussion. But I think that when you look at your entire organization, it's also the understanding that disability is everywhere. I mean, people with disabilities are in all parts of your organization. So we're not just looking at disability and disability constituency from an audience component, but that disability really kind of runs throughout your organization. So that the commitment to access really is a top-down and should impact every part of your organization, because people with disabilities are in every part of your organization. So it's really important to look at your entire organization and the commitment to access throughout your entire organization.
So we spoke a little bit about the importance of advisory boards, or the importance, rather, of a self-assessment. Mm-hmm. And we do have a tool, and later in the presentation we'll show you where that is on our website, on the Theater Alliance website. But here in New Jersey, we are really big proponents of encouraging organizations to go through a self-assessment survey so that they can walk through their facility and see what elements are in terms of doorways, widths, in terms of counter heights, dressing rooms, office spaces, all the various elements of program. By going through the survey, they not only can actually do a self-assessment of what they currently have, by going through the survey, they'll also learn what's possible. The self-assessment survey that we have is quite a large document. It's broken into something for performing arts and then something for visual arts. And along with each question of the self-assessment survey, on the right-hand column, there's a guide to the answer. And it also, by going through this exercise, it also educates individuals on what is possible. We encourage that people go through the self-assessment with a colleague. For example, when they get to the facility component of the assessment, that they walk around with perhaps a facility manager, maybe an architect that's been on the board that's familiar with the organization. When they talk about marketing, that they actually do that portion of the assessment with somebody on their marketing team. So we do encourage that this is done as a group effort, and certainly not done all in one sitting. It can certainly be done over a period of time. But by doing the assessment, it does give the organization certainly a better understanding of where they are, what's possible, how they can begin to plan to meet all the various accessible benchmarks over the next 3 to 5 years. And it's important that they understand to be realistic, that full access does not happen overnight. It does take steps. That's the purpose of the plan. And this survey is, we believe, a very good step as they begin that process.
And John, if I could just add one more thing too.
Sure.
In terms of walking through your organization when you're doing these assessments, one really good suggestion would be to walk through with a person with a disability. If you can get someone to walk through with you along with members of your staff, I think you will find a lot of information that you never thought about that will be really helpful in devising your plan. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Absolutely. So there are some things that we believe are readily achievable that organizations can do within a few-month period. First, they could take a look at their policies. A board-approved policy statement that states that ABC organization is committed to ensuring that all individuals, regardless of ability, experiences the programs and services of the organization with a dignity and independence. That's a sample policy statement, and that needs to be approved by the board, going back to our belief that this is an organizational priority and needs to start at the top. A service provision request policy, letting individuals know what various services are being provided. If there's a particular request, how does a patron request that policy or that service? We like advanced notification policies. This educates the public that if they do need a service like a sign interpreter, an audio describer, a captioner, that they do need to let the organization know in advance. Certainly organizations need to be accommodating regardless of when the request comes in, but certainly we recommend a 2-week notification policy that an individual that might need a service like a captioner, an interpreter, or an audio describer, that they contact the organization at least 2 weeks notice, which would give the organization certainly plenty of time to secure that talent. But certainly if an individual does contact the organization less than 2 weeks, the organization will, of course, do what it can to meet that individual's request. Grievance procedures are important. If a patron does have a grievance, what is the process that that patron needs to go through? Hopefully the grievance can actually be handled at the time that the grievance is occurring, but if it requires more communication and process and discussion, what is that process that the patron will go through? Sensitivity training for staff and volunteers. We do quite a bit of this in New Jersey and really encourage organizations to offer this at least once a year so that their environment is welcoming. We want we want all of our patrons to feel welcomed when they come to our organization. We also know that there's a lot of turnover, especially in those positions that are that are the point people with the public, such as box office, receptionists, ushers, docents. It's important that they go through this training and have an understanding of the best way to create the most welcoming environment possible. And we work very closely with our county offices that serve people with disabilities, members of our Cultural Access Network Committee, those individuals that have a disability that can actually share their own experiences and what is a welcoming environment for them. That certainly helps and personalizes the sensitivity training sessions. Assigning an ADA coordinator. Yes, it is an organizational priority, but as we mentioned, there is one person at the organization that does need to make sure that the plan and the goals and strategies around your ADA programming is moving forward. Sometimes it's somebody in the box office, sometimes it's a house manager, sometimes it's somebody in the marketing department. I know a couple of organizations that just have very dedicated volunteers who have taken on that role. So that is important to identify who that will be. The use of access symbols, the international access symbols, that's very important because individuals will certainly, when seeing those symbols, it certainly tells them that there's something there for them to look into further. And you can add those in printed materials on your website. That's an easy first step, and they're available, and they are free. And as we talked about the importance of establishing an advisory committee, you might be able to share one with a couple of cultural organizations in a community, but they can certainly be wonderful ambassadors, but they also can be extremely helpful in creating policy, even helping you, as Beth had mentioned, in your self-assessment as you walk through your organization. So here are just a few items here of the role of an advisory board. As we said, they can provide you guidance in developing your programs and services. They are certainly your greatest ambassadors to help spread the word. they can help identify some funding opportunities. They can play a great role in staff and volunteer training, help you review your policies, target market your programming for you. And as I said, many of our organizations in New Jersey have shared advisory boards. So for example, in Morristown, where my office is, we have several cultural organizations, about a half a dozen that are in just a few blocks of each other. So rather than each organization taking on their own advisory board, they're sharing one for those 6 organizations, and that has proven to be successful since each organization, if they did it on their own, would probably go after many of the same people. So having one for the community seems to be working. So that's another avenue to take when thinking about advisory boards.
Oh, this is
Beth, you want to talk a little bit about language?
Sure. Language is always an item that is brought up a lot for people in terms of people sometimes having questions about language, people well, let's talk about language. Language in terms of people with disabilities is a very fluid and not set in stone item. And I know it's always an issue of people being unsure about language to use around people with disabilities, people feeling a little uncomfortable about what language they can use. And I think the important thing to understand is that language changes. And I think the most important thing to remember is that I think people should always feel comfortable to ask. And I think that that's the part that I want to stress, is that if you're unsure of language to use around a person with a disability, or you're not sure, I think if you treat language with the respect and dignity that any language is afforded, that I think people with disabilities will be equally welcoming and understanding of questions that you have about language. I think one of the hardest things that ultimately happens around disability is that people are afraid. And when people are afraid, they don't ask. And I think we need to, change that thought process and feel like it's okay to ask a question. And I think it's also important to trust the person with a disability, to trust that if they're uncomfortable with answering, that it's okay for somebody to say, I don't feel comfortable with answering that. Or, but I think that not to ask the question is almost not that it's worse, but it's important to be able to feel comfortable to ask. And I think everybody should always trust their instinct and trust the other person to know that for all of us to move ahead, we have to be able to talk to each other. And also understanding that, people with disabilities are not the same. Everybody has different feelings. Everybody has different identities. Everybody has different thoughts about the language that they use, and that to ask the question, I think, is the most important thing.
And the language, if I could add, is really important in not only when you're conversing with individuals, potentially employees, patrons, artists with disabilities, but also in your marketing materials, your press releases, how you describe your programs on your website. Language is very, very important, and if you are going to be marketing to certain constituents, it's important that the language is clear and those messages are appropriate in all areas of communication.
And it's also important, just like you said, to understand how that specific constituency and community uses the languages within their communities. And so that's important as well, because there's things that might be talked about within a certain community that's acceptable and it's not acceptable. So it's really important. And that goes back to the ambassadors and your advisory boards and people that you might know from within those communities, and that's where they become really important advocates and allies to be able to talk to about how to converse with and how to have conversations within the specific communities.
Mm-hmm. That's also why this training with staff and volunteers to do that at least once a year. I know some organizations that actually do it twice a year. is really important, because that comes up quite a bit in those trainings where staff of the organization have an opportunity to ask, as Beth said, if they're not sure, to ask questions around the language. What's the appropriate way to approach somebody? When I'm describing our services, what are the best what's the best terminology for me to use? So those training opportunities provide a wonderful learning experience and an opportunity for staff to actually ask questions of the individuals that are conducting the training, be it members of your advisory board, members from a local organization that serve people with disabilities. It's very important when you are doing this training that you definitely have individuals with disabilities a part of that training program.
Absolutely.
And
I
right
think
now,
that can't be stressed. I think that can't be stressed too much, is that when we're really talking about inclusion of people with disabilities, so we're not doing programs necessarily only for people, but we're doing programs and services with people so that people are included in the process, and they can be incredibly helpful to you in all aspects of this.
And the slide I have up right now is the language of disability. This is something, a do's and don'ts list that a former organization known Inclusion in the Arts put together, which is, we believe, very helpful. We don't have to go through all 10, but there's certainly certain terms that are just not appropriate to use, that would be, that would offend an individual. And language, as Beth had said, language certainly over decades has altered and changed for the better, keeping in mind that individuals with or without a disability are individuals and not defined by their disability. So it's important to keep that in mind. But it's, I think, taking a look at this list here is, I think, extremely helpful, can be helpful in a training session. Beth, anything you want to add about this list?
I think just that if you're ever not sure, ask the question. That's the point I think I want to make. If you're ever not sure if a term should be used or not should be used, or if you're unsure of, about what is acceptable, ask the question about whether it is or not. I think that's much more preferred rather than just not saying anything. So while there are definitely terms now in our society that most people are aware of should not be used, if you're ever not sure, ask the question.
Mm-hmm. So an important part to give some thought to is around employment. Employment of management, employment of artists, even your volunteers. They certainly are staff of your organizations. They just are extremely generous in terms of giving of their time, but they certainly are part of your management structure. And so to think about accessibility from that perspective, if you're going to interview somebody for a position, whether it's to discuss somebody about a volunteer position, or audition an artist, or interview somebody for a management position, that you're always going to make sure that those interviews and discussions occur in an accessible location. If you have employment forms that do need to be completed, make sure that you have them available in various formats. Maybe the specific something online may not be accessible for somebody, or the standard printed employment form where you're asking somebody to, if they stop by, to fill it out. Again, that may not be appropriate. So again, to ensure that whatever form, whatever format works for that individual that you're interviewing, that you can accommodate their request. To give some thought to the marginal and essential job function. I'll give you an example that an individual that was on our Cultural Access Network committee, he works for an agency, and he was looking for an office manager, and the essential job requirements were you'd be able to utilize the computer, do some research, answer the phone, take minutes at meetings. One other element was also collecting and sorting mail. Well, he put that job requirement in a marginal. He did interview an individual, and they met all the essential functions of the job. This individual was a wheelchair user. The only problem was that in the way that the mailroom was structured, it would have been a little bit difficult for acquiring and sorting the mail. So this individual actually felt that that was a marginal function of the job. This individual could meet all the essential functions and meet them well, that they just made that, that mail sorting, they passed that responsibility on to another individual in the office. And, but they were very clear on what the essential job requirements were, and that was important when they were interviewing the individual and finding the right candidate. So it's important that organizations give thought when creating job descriptions around those essential and marginal functions.
And John, can I just jump in?
Sure.
I'm not a lawyer, and this is definitely something that people might want to talk with their HR departments about, because there really are very specific requirements about things that you can ask a person with a disability versus what you can't ask a person regarding their disability. So those are just, I'm just kind of throwing that out there, that these are things that you might want to check, whether it's going back to the Americans with Disabilities Act and specifically the Employment Act of the ADA, about questions that you can ask and you can't ask. That just might be something that people might want to look into.
Right. Very good point. You cannot ask an individual about their disability. That is not, that is against the law, as whether it's somebody applying for a job or a patron that needs a service. You cannot ask about the individual's particular disability. But that's a very good point. If you have if an organization has an HR committee or an attorney on their board who has background in employment or has a colleague with the background in employment, it's always good to have those job descriptions shared and looked at before they are distributed.
Yes.
So programs and services are certainly a very big piece in terms of thinking about accessibility. We're in the arts, so that it can be enjoyed and shared by everyone. So it's important to give thought to the programs and services and steps that one can take to make those programs and services accessible. And Beth, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the bullet points here on this slide?
Sure. I know that it was mentioned early on that I think the next webinar is going to be specifically about marketing. But I think because we're really talking about ADA planning and really covering all aspects of your organization, we're really going to touch upon some programs and services just lightly, so then hopefully they can go into this in more detail through the next webinar, and you get more details about specific marketing programs. So the main thing with programs and services that I think the bullet point points out is that people with disabilities are not all the same, and every disability and everybody's disability is personal to them, and their needs for accessing your programs and services can be different. So we always want to stress in that all disability isn't the same, and so a lot of the programs that you're going to be thinking about to provide are not necessarily going to cover everybody's needs. So it's always important, I think, to deal with that personal issue so that you can have a conversation with somebody and find out what's actually going to be working for that individual person, because I think the ultimate goal with all our organizations is we want to be welcoming to people. We want people to be able to come to our organizations and enjoy the product that we're serving. So I think the bullet point of never say no, or we can't, or we won't, or we don't, you might. I mean, it's talk to the person, and I think that, again, is what we're stressing, is that a lot of the conversations that you can have with a person and a lot of the readily achievable programs and services you can do have to do with, talking to somebody and finding out what they need, and it might be not as complicated as you think. So talk to the person, find out what they need to make their participation and their visit enjoyable and welcoming, and see if you can do it. And so that's the main point, the overall point that I think I want to make in terms of programs in general, is to find out what will work for that person, and ask.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that suggestions that we mentioned to our staff members of box offices or in information desk, who's ever speaking with the public, when they do make a reservation or inquire about a program, to just ask that individual, what could we do to make your visit with us more accommodating? That's a very a wonderful customer service focus, and I can tell you, I mean, I would be thrilled if I called and made a reservation and somebody actually asked me that question, whether I need an accommodation or not. Just the fact that that organization gave thought to what, because many individuals, as we know, are very shy for whatever reason to ask for assistance or feel that they're asking for something, quote unquote, special. But again, this is where a policy at an organization is really important, that when calls come in to an organization and people are making reservations, that you take that 30 seconds to say, what could we do to make your visit with us more accommodating? And that's the ask part. And some individuals would say, nothing at this time. Or they might say, well, now that you've mentioned it, my mother has some vision loss, and if you have anything in those first couple of rows, that would really be helpful to her. And they may not have asked that if the organization didn't open up the offer. And even if you do something in that case for somebody with vision, have other services for somebody for vision loss, that gives an opportunity for that person at the organization to have a conversation with the patron and say, yes, we can certainly try to look into that. Do you know about other services we offer individuals with vision loss? And sometimes some folks just may not know that you have some of these other services. So in other words, it's just important, as Beth said, to ask and have a conversation. And this is all about customer service. So to keep that in mind.
Sorry, and that goes back to the point of that disability is personal. You know, as a person with a disability, I know what's best for me, and I know what I need. And, you know, what I need is probably different than what somebody else might need. So this idea of somebody asking me what would make my experience, I can tell them. And so it's that kind of conversation that you can have with the person, I think, that opens up that welcoming experience for everybody.